In the summer of 1857, Thomas C. Palmer of Ohio gathered together some grayish-white rocks to surround a campfire he had built on the east side of the Big Blue River in Marshall County, Kansas, about 3 miles northwest of Blue Rapids. After the fire burned, he noticed the rocks had turned to powder. Mr. Palmer found when the powder was wet and then dried, it hardened again. He made use of the powder to plaster a cabin he built later. Most of this information in this presentation is gathered from a book written by Aretha Rudy titled It Happened Here, which is largely a history of Marshall County, Kansas. John Kuhn of Elwira, Ohio, came to Blue Rapids in 1871, recognized the white rock, made plaster, and took it back to Ohio. He returned to Blue Rapids with orders for 2 carloads. He and his son, Emir, put a shed up on the east side of the Big Blue River below the dam. Business was good, and by 1874, the Kuhns were able to build a $12,000 3-story stone mill on the west side of the river. Pebble gypsum was reduced to raw plaster, which was calcinated in a dry kiln. It was then run through a reel lined with a fine mesh wire cloth. That which came through the mesh was sold for dental plaster, and the remainder used for wall plaster. The mill ran day and night to produce a maximum of 80 barrels of plaster a day. The Kuhn mill was sold in 1887 to M.T. Cummings of Beatrice, Nebraska, who converted it into a corn meal mill, which was destroyed by fire in 1907. Off of the northwest corner of Blue Rapids, after the river left an oxbow in the early part of the century, we referred to the land as the island. That island did house plaster mills. In this presentation, we're going to follow these mills and mining operations to their conclusions. However, it should be noted that this information may or may not be 100% complete. There is evidence that other operations existed in the county and near Blue Rapids that we cannot find information for at this time. The Fowler Brothers Blue Rapids Plaster Mill, and this is sites 2 and 3. Hiram and Frank Fowler mined and quarried gypsum rock on what is now known as the Dolan Farm. This is site number 2. From the mine, the rock was floated downriver by barge to Fowler's single kettle mill in a frame building on the west end of the bridge over the dam, also known as the island. Site 3. The roof on their building proclaimed sunflower plaster and the best on earth. They powered their mill with a water wheel placed in the race north of the bridge. Fowler's business flourished until a lengthy litigation over a patent forced the brothers to sell out to the United States Gypsum Company in 1902. The mill was so badly damaged in the 1903 flood that it had to be demolished. The United States Gypsum Company took over the Fowler Brothers upriver mine operation in 1902 after the lengthy patent litigation. The flood of 1903 put an end to their building and their business.
Okay.
Blue Valley Plaster Company at site number 4, 1892, and ending at an undetermined date. A.E. Winters formed this company, erecting a mill where a dam had been constructed on the Little Blue River about 1/2 mile above its junction with the Big Blue River. Rock on the west side of the river resembled marble and was dubbed Marble Falls by the first settlers. Upon completion of the mill, the stockholders sold to the U.S. Gypsum Company which then started operations. The map is a 1905 Sanders map. Sanborn map. United States Gypsum Company operated the site until 1916. At site number 4, U.S. Gypsum on the Little Blue River had difficulty keeping steady employees because of its isolated location. The company constructed a boarding house. 2 buildings were constructed southeast of the mill. A 2-story, 20-foot by 30-foot dwelling was used as a kitchen, dining hall, and living quarters for the couple who managed the boarding house. The other 1-story, 28 by 54-foot building had a parlor with 5 bedrooms on each side. Ray Dutch Heinzelman, Marysville, whose father worked at U.S. Gypsum, says the workers crossed the river in an overhead cable car which was rigged up when the Whiteside Bridge went out in the flood of 1908. U.S. Gypsum exhausted its gypsum supply and could no longer obtain land in the vicinity of its mill. In 1960, United States Gypsum number 2, site number 8, started operation in 1916 and ran through an undetermined date. When the United States Gypsum Mine number 1 exhausted its gypsum supply, it could no longer obtain land in the vicinity of its mill. In 1916, U.S. Gypsum erected a new $150,000 concrete and steel mill south of Blue Rapids on what at that time was the Yarrick Ranch, now the property of Dr. Kenneth Dunsing. The next time U.S. Gypsum ran out of rock, it moved out, taking its mill with it. The entire plant was dismantled, loaded on rail cars, and shipped off to another state. Site number 6 is the Electric Plaster Company, which operated from 1901 until either 1911 or 1912. After selling their Great Western Plaster Company to the American Cement Plaster of Lawrence, the 3 Blue Rapids men and 2 Beatty men purchased gypsum rights northwest of Blue Rapids, organized the Electric Plaster Company, and put up a 2-kettle mill, which was located across the Blue River from town and on a spur of the old Union Pacific rail line. The company purchased an abandoned flour mill at the dam and installed a hydroelectric plant to generate power for the plaster mill and the city of Blue Rapids. The Electric Plaster Company got into trouble with its all-electric mill when the hydro plant at the dam could not produce enough power for peak production at the mill and still furnish electricity for the city of Blue Rapids. When M. Henley of the American Plaster Company bought controlling interest of the company, operations soon ceased and the building was torn down. An old miner recalled that a man named Ayers was killed when he fell from a great height and pierced his spine on a large spike while helping raise the Electric Plaster Company mill in 1912. The Blue Rapids Company, site number 7, the year 1906. A group of moneyed men in Marysville saw all the gypsum mining activity in the Blue Rapids area and decided to get in on the action. They formed the Blue Rapids Company, secured gypsum rights, and put up a plaster mill northwest of Blue Rapids. Their mill opened in February 1906, but the enterprise was short-lived. Either there was more to running a plaster business than they had anticipated, or they jumped at the chance to turn a quick profit. For 10 months later, a Lawrence man purchased the mill for his American Cement Plaster Company. It then became known as American Cement Plaster Mill number 2 and was used for plasterboard production only. American Cement Plaster Mill number 2 was site number 7, operated from 1906 through an undetermined date. Having belonged briefly to the Blue Rapids Company, this mill soon became the mainstay for American Cement Plaster as its plasterboard mill. It was eventually closed as number 1 was improved and enlarged. Great Western Plaster Company, site number 5, 1894 through 1901. 3 Blue Rapids men and 2 Beatty men formed the Great Western Plaster Company in 1894. Their mill was built below the bluff, north of the river, close to the river road known as the Narrows. They employed a crew of 8 who brought out 50 tons of rock each day on mule-powered rail cars. 7 years later, they sold out to the American Cement Plaster Company of Lawrence. The owners then purchased gypsum rights northwest of Blue Rapids and organized the Electric Plaster Company. American Cement Plaster number 1. This is site number 5, covering from 1901 through 1928. Started as the Great Western Plaster Company but purchased by people from Lawrence, the American Cement Plaster number 1 soon became a major producer. At the start of the 20th century, 3 plaster mills dotted the area around Blue Rapids: the United States Gypsum Company, Electric Plaster Company, and American Cement Plaster Company. After 1906, when American Cement opened a second mill, there were 250 employees who shared $15,000 in monthly wages for an average of about $60 each. While most employees took their paychecks home to wife and children, there in fact was a rowdy element. While there were no open saloons in Blue Rapids, there were always bootleggers. According to the Blue Rapids Times in 1907, one bootlegger brought a wagon load of beer to the town square where he sold out in short order. The Times declared the empty bottles strewn around the square the next morning testified to the debauchery of the night before. Before long, American Cement Plaster was flourishing alone where 4 mills had once done business. In the 1940s, Ray Ellenbecker of Marysville photographed each step of the mining process. At the request of the mining manager, the pictures were not published at that time. After years in operation, the American Cement Plaster sold out to Beaver Products of Buffalo, New York. Beaver Products, location 5, 1928. Beaver Products of Buffalo, New York bought out American Cement Plaster and in turn sold to Certainty in 1928. Certainty at site number 5, 1928, up to Tuttle Creek Dam. The survivor of all the mills in the 20th century was American Cement Plaster, and their business continued to thrive under Certainty. The mules used to pull the loaded tram cars from the mine were stabled in a barn on the plant grounds. Breeders from the area southwest of Frankfort furnished mules for the mining companies for many years. It is said that one bulky mule was swept away when floodwaters of the Big Blue invaded the environs of Certainty in 1941. But the greatest loss was $10,000 of plaster bags when water reached the ceiling of the company warehouse. The use of mules was discontinued in the mid-1950s. Mill number 2 was eventually closed as mill number 1 was improved and enlarged. Stories grew about a ghost who could be heard tapping on the west side of the mine. Legend has it that a miner's leg was trapped by falling rock. When other miners could not free the leg, a resourceful fellow whipped out his knife and cut off the leg. The unfortunate victim bled to death. Later, imaginative miners claimed to hear the ghost of the miner tapping as he searched for his missing leg. Safety at the mines was always an issue. There has never been a disaster claiming several lives at once. However, names of men killed include Arnold, Nelson, Paget, Upholt, and Radford. Upholt had come from working the coal mines of Kentucky and had only worked here about a month. when a leak from a carbon lamp on his miner's hat hit a powder keg, according to Ben Mall. Certainty sold the operation to Bestwall as Tuttle Creek Dam lurked in the shadows. Pictures of people associated with the Certainty operation include this one, which pictures Kenneth Brown, Charles Beasley, Thumbs Marcy, Jack Saville, Kelma Capitan, J. Ben Mall, Merlin Rupp, and Eugene Fincham. This picture is at the Rock Scales, and it shows Orville Thomas. Plant manager K.W. Brown is at the right. The repair crew includes Vincent Van Sickle, Nels Johnson, Al Eckert, Lawrence Lefty Rupp, and Bill Dewalt. This picture at the Raymonds, which is a grinder, and shows Bob Grabhorn. This picture shows drillers in the mine, Charles Stewart and Wayne McMillan. This picture shows the mixer filler, at the time Frank Balderson. And this last picture shows the driller in the mine, who at that time was Earl Johnson. The driller drilled the holes for blasting. Continuing with site number 5 and on to site 9, Bestwall, through 1965. Bestwall took over from Certainty when Tuttle Creek Dam was being put in. Plans were underway to relocate the mill atop the hill, with Uncle Sam footing the moving bill. But before the new mill could be completed, number 1, which had stood since 1896, was destroyed by fire in August of 1960. The next summer, mining continued with the rocks trucked uphill and stockpiled to await milling at the new plant in 1961. In 1965, Bestwall merged with Georgia Pacific. This series of pictures was all taken at site number 5, commonly known to the natives as the River Bottom site.